sorting out each mission can bring a man to grief. For we are the bomb-proof, tired and blue. We wish our flying days were through, but now we've got a mission according to the book.
So we sit in our very fine airplane, constructed of paper and wood. It's okay for lugging cheap whiskey, but for combat it just ain't no good. And if you should get in a pickle and don't know the right way to turn, that's when you reach up on the dashboard, push a button, mark, spin, crash, and burn.
Early in the morning when the engines start to roar, you can see the old goat standing in the operations door. He'll be sweating out the takeoff as he always has before. Safe behind his armor-plated desk, take 'em off, take 'em off, take 'em off.
You can hear him in the briefing as he stands back in the rear. Though the runway's sucked in solid, still the targets may be clear. You've been here for 20 months, boys, but you've got another year.
Says the man behind the armor-plated desk, take 'em off, take 'em off, take 'em off.
When the lead ship starts to shudder and the end seems close at hand, who is flying on the sofa with his headset on command? Who yells, climb up on top, boys, with a highball in his hands?
The man behind the armor-plated desk, take 'em off, take 'em off, take 'em off.
4 times he's let us up there and he's always let us back, for he'd circle o'er the IP as we went into attack. He says I'm hard yet fair, men, but allergic to ack-ack.
The man behind the armor-plated desk. When our mission days are over and we all go up the drain, you can look around the airfield, but your search will be in vain. For we all will be in London getting drunk and raising Cain, like the man behind the armor-plated desk. The man behind the armor-plated desk.
This program, this symposium, is one of the many projects sponsored by the 8th Air Force Memorial Museum Foundation. Now, as you know, this is the 12th annual symposium that we have sponsored. Everyone has been a success. I predict that this particular symposium on escape and evasion will go down as the largest attended one and also the best. Bob?
Today when you leave, ladies and gentlemen, I'm sure each of you will share with all of us who've seen this program and met these very, very interesting people that this will probably be the most compellingly interesting program that you'll ever see or leave with, which talks to the times and rough times of our World War II 8th Air Force days. Without further ado, I know the gentleman that I'm about to introduce needs no introduction to any or all of us. Our esteemed historian, the mighty 8th author, Mr. Roger Freeman. Roger.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. It's my rule, always clap afterwards. You don't know what you're going to hear. But I can assure you, you're going to hear some incredible stories today. In fact, I have no hesitation in saying that you are going to meet some of the most courageous and resourceful individuals of your generation. During the Second World War, some 3,500 Allied airmen who were shot down over the occupied countries of Western Europe were helped and sheltered by some very brave people in those countries, Holland, Belgium, France. Those helpers, as they were called, knew one thing for sure. If they were ever apprehended, it would be a firing squad. And that needs real courage. And this is really what today's symposium is about. Now I'm going to introduce you to Ralph Patton, who was the first president of the Air Force Escape and Evasion Society, an organization which over the years has done a great deal to keep alive the memory and the deeds of those brave people in the occupied countries. Ralph was shot down himself on the 5th of January 1944 and was with the French underground for roughly 2.5 months until the British sailed him out back to England. But Ralph will tell you his own tale. Ralph, the stage is yours.
I hope you can all hear me.
Yeah.
It's a privilege for me to present this story to you today, and I'm happy to see it's such a large group that is in attendance. We do have an interesting story, but first I have the privilege and the honor of introducing some guests that have seen fit to favor us with their presence today. In the front row, we have a dear friend of AFIS and a dear friend of the 8th Air Force Historical Society. She helped over 100 American airmen while she lived in Belgium. I'd like to introduce Madame Anne Brusselmans, who now lives in Florida and in Georgia. Anne Brusselmans, who I think several of the airmen she helped are in the audience. And in addition, of course, I don't want to have Yvonne feel neglected. I would like her daughter, Yvonne Daly, who gave up her bed to all these visiting airmen when she was 14 years of age. Yvonne Brusselmans Daly. We are privileged to have in the audience 6 Belgians who are on a visit to the United States, courtesy of Leland Smith over in Lexington. And I would like to introduce to you Piet and Brigitte Daudet. Piet's father, Joseph, was a member of the Secret Army Belge, and he helped American flyers to escape. He was executed by the Germans. Piet and Brigitte Daudet. Paul and Francoise Wendels. Paul's father, Marcel, was a member of the Secret Army Belge. He helped flyers to escape, and he also was executed by the Germans. Paul and Francoise Wendel. In addition, we have Raoul and Maria Staillard, who are from Belgium, and Raoul was a member of the Secret Army Belge. Bienvenue. Nous sommes très contents que vous êtes ici, que vous êtes parmi nous aujourd'hui. Bienvenue à Bon Séjour. In addition, we're very fortunate to have with us a man that has helped me in putting together this program, a chap who was a member of the intelligence service in the United States Air Forces in Europe, born in Sweden, came to the United States at 17. I'd like to introduce Colonel Stone Christopher. We have another friend in the audience who was married to one of our panelists, and I'd like to introduce Colonel Roger Files, who was a fighter pilot, but fortunately or unfortunately not with the 8th Air Force. Colonel Files. We're very fortunate. We have a pretty good attendance from AFIS, our AFIS members present, and I'd like the AFIS members present and all evaders, whether or not members of AFIS, all evaders, please stand up. Have the lights, please. We'll proceed on course here, I hope on course. I'm going to tell you a little bit about AFIS. We tried to find an acronym, but we couldn't come up with anything that was suitable. So the Air Force's Escape and Evasion Society was formed in 1964 as a result of a meeting of 35 American airmen who had been shot down in Western France and came out by means of Operation Bonaparte. Of course, at the time we didn't know anything about what Operation Bonaparte was, but we knew a couple of the leaders. And we invited the leaders of the réseau from Buffalo, New York in 1964. On the left is Raymond Ross, who was a radio operator. You're losing me, or I'm losing you? Okay, the lady is Anita Lemonnier, who was an interrogator, spoke fluent English. She lived in Paris. She interrogated all airmen coming through the Shelburne line. The little chap in the middle is Captain Lucien Dumais, who was a sergeant major in the Fusiliers Montreal, and was captured at Dieppe, escaped, and got back to England, volunteered to go back into France to set up Réseau Shelburne. The man on the right is Mathieu Branchou, who was a resistance leader, World War I veteran, and he organized the resistance in the town of Guingamp in western France. The outgrowth of that meeting was AFES, the Air Force's Escape and Evasion Society, whose raison d'etre is to let the people that risk their lives to help us know that we have not forgotten what they did. This pin is a lapel pin presented to all bona fide helpers, and unfortunately it's difficult to read, but it says, "We will never forget." And that is the slogan, and that is the reason we exist. We present certificates of appreciation to the helpers. Each and every day somebody deserving comes out of the woodwork, and we send them certificates. Every year we send over 600 Christmas cards to our helpers overseas. We 3 times a year publish a newsletter and have a meeting every year, reunion. In one of our ceremonies we presented a plaque on the Plage Bonaparte, where we departed from France in 1944. This says, "We, the 94 American aviators who embarked for England from this beach on the dark nights of 1944, say to our friends of Réseau Shelburne, we will never forget." Again, advancing the theme. This was a monument, a marker that I had the pleasure of dedicating to my 3 crewmen who were killed near the village of Cabrice-Belot in western France. We had in 1976, we had 72 Frenchmen to the White House for a visit. And in 1978, we had 34 Dutch helpers to visit with President Carter at that time. In addition, we had a big ceremony at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier where 2 very fine Dutch helpers presented a wreath in memory of the unknown soldiers. This has been a slogan. We've passed out thousands of these buttons in western France and throughout Paris, from Paris all the way west. This is when it all started, and I'm sure all of you remember the day in 1941 when things hit the fan and your life was changed forever. I was a young man of 21, I was healthy, I was single, and I was pretty good draft bait. So in April of 42, I enlisted in the U.S. Army Air Forces, ended up as a cadet. My first airplane ride was in Sykeston, Missouri in a PT-19. I graduated after 60 hours to Coffeyville, Kansas, where I flew BT-13s on to Aldous, Oklahoma for AT-17 training in AT-9, a few hours in an AT-9. When we graduated from Aldous, we were sent to Pyote, Texas for B-26 training. The only B-26s they ever saw down there had 4 engines and were made by Boeing. I ended up as a co-pilot on the B-17 of the 94th Bomb Group, 331st Squadron, going overseas in October of 1943 with the Glenn Johnson crew number 38 of the Reeves Provisional Group. We started flying combat missions in October of 1943, and on the 5th of January 1944, we bombed the airfield at Merignac, which was about 40 miles east of Bordeaux. And over the target, we were attacked by Me-109 fighters that put holes in our horizontal stabilizer, the right horizontal stabilizer, and the big vertical stabilizer. We were unable to keep pace with the formation, going back up over the Bay of Biscay, and right smack dab in the middle of the Britain Peninsula, we had an attack by FW-190s flying out of Lorient. We did very well in evading their attacks for 2 passes, And we tried to turn slowly and change altitude up and down, and the first two passes were not very fruitful. But then we found we were headed directly back into France, and that didn't seem like a very good idea either. So we gave it a pretty good 90-degree turn, and at that point the attack came through and the entire tail assembly of the airplane came off. So we bailed out as best we could. 3 of our men were not able to make it. And 2 weeks later, my mother got this telegram. I don't know whether it's legible or not. But in any event, many of you have these and have seen them. The airplane landed in a hedgerow in western France, burned for days. The Germans came and the 3 bodies that were in the plane were taken and given a decent burial in the countryside. I landed next to this hedgerow and my parachute collapsed around me, and I immediately took off towards this farmhouse to try to see if I could communicate with anybody. They obviously spoke no English. As a matter of fact, I'm not even sure they spoke French. This was in a small Breton community where the tongue was Breton. The old people spoke no French. But in any event, when I couldn't communicate with them, I turned around and immediately saw my first pilot, my bombardier, coming up across the field. So the 3 of us took off, hid into the woods, tried to dispose of what things we had that we thought the Germans might find of interest or that might precipitate questions that we didn't want to answer. So then we walked for about till that evening, and we came across the home of Lucien Garand, and Lucien spoke no English. He invited us into his home, fed us some hot soup, and then took us out to a neighbor to put us up for the night. So we went to the neighbor's house, Albert Demant, and Albert put us up in a nice soft bed. So our first night in France, we slept in a very beautiful bed with what am I trying to think of? Feather comforters. Yeah. So then the next morning he turned us loose. He didn't know what to do with us. It said head in a certain direction, so we went cross country until we came to the town of Warrack. And we slept in a haystack that night, and then the next morning we're walking down the road and 2 figures popped up out of the ditch. We thought, God, they were German for sure, but they turned out to have been our waist gunner and the navigator from another crew. So now we're 5. 5 of us are wandering around in uniform, violating all the rules that we've been learned to handle. Cruising across the country, we went across the canal. The German observation post was on a hill across the canal, and then took off again at night, walking in the curfew, and we came to the town of Bourret. We came in from the upper right, and we were smart enough to think you don't go walking through town at high noon. So we walked around the town to the left, and we came out on the road at the lower corner, the lower left-hand corner of the screen. And we looked back up the road, and there's a schoolboy standing in the middle of the road. We said, oh God, what do we do now? So we knew that he had seen us. We paused for about 2 or 3 minutes, and finally, the hell with it, and away we went. We went walking down the road. But what had happened is the schoolboy went back to school, and he was late. And the teacher wanted to know, you know, what's going on here? How come you were late coming back? And he said he had seen 5 American soldiers in the road. Well, you know, this blew Tony's mind. And Tony turned her class over to Monsieur Daniel, the chap we called Mr. Chips. And she came looking for us, and she found us out hiding in a field where some other Frenchman had taken us. And this Frenchman had taken us into a bistro with the largest wine barrels I'd ever seen in my life. At least 6 feet tall. And they fed us wine, and they had hot soup for us. We didn't know, and we didn't care. We wore on. In any event, Tony came with her friends that night, and they took us back to the schoolhouse, all 5 of us now. Well, she couldn't put up 5 in the schoolhouse, so 2 of them went with Marcel and with Josephine on the left. Josephine lived in a home next to the school, and her parents, she lived with her parents, and she brought these 2 airmen in to sleep in this house. So at night, 2 of us stayed in the schoolhouse, 2 of us came to this house, and 1 of them went with Marcel, who was the other chap in that picture, who's now Josephine's husband, but they were affianced at the time. So Marcel lived across the street, and it was the damnedest circus you ever saw at night. All these 3 guys would leave the school, and then in the morning they had to get back. Well, there was hell to pay when it snowed one night, and all the footprints were in the snow. But we would go out to This was a little store where they found provisions for us, and they provided us with provided the school teacher with some food to feed us. This was a picture of me and Mr. Danielle, Mr. Chips, taken outside the schoolhouse door. We were trying to get a photograph for my false identity card. Mr. Danielle, Mr. Chips, was killed by the Germans 4 days before the liberation of their town. They made, while we were holed up, they had to make false identity cards for us. And this was my false identity card. I was Rani Payi. I was a traveling salesman, but I was also a mute. They also had to provide a card in German for us, so that if we went through the patrols, that we had the right to be in the forbidden zone around the coast. These are some of the cards. They stole all the damn rubber stamps they could find in the various mayories and in the offices and so forth. And this, after the liberation, they made they took all these rubber stamps and made a composite of it. So that's what they have there. All the time we're hiding here. 5 weeks now, 5 of us are in this neighborhood of the schoolhouse. And the Germans are posting the warning signs. Warning. Ibis is warning all persons of the masculine sex who aid directly or indirectly the crews of aircraft coming down in parachute or making a forced landing or hiding them in any manner will be shot in the field. And the other one that said the women who render the same type of aid will be sent to concentration camps in Germany. And I didn't realize the word concentration camp was, I thought maybe we had originated as a derogatory term, but it apparently has other meaning. But these warning signs were posted all throughout the occupied country. A bit of passive resistance that always just tickled the hell out of me. I would see they gave me these French 20-franc notes, and they would cut the head of Hitler out of a postage stamp, and then put it in, cut a little slit in the rope, and insert it in the rope, and then circulate it. And I brought this one back with me, and I know another evader who has one also, so it was something that was not uncommon. And while we were in hiding, some of you guys were up there dropping letters and newspapers to them, and here they're saying the RAF and the USF.
Can't hear you.
The RAF and the USAF dropped over 6,000 tons of bomb in the lower there. In 2 years, the 8th U.S. Air Force has shot down 3,385 German aircraft. So we had our own propaganda. We were trying to communicate to the French what was going on in the real world. After 5 weeks, wiser heads prevailed. They decided that it was stupid and risky for us to be holed up in this same village. So they split us up, and 2 of us went to the little bistro about 2.5 miles down the road. I stayed in this place for 2 weeks with another chap, and very seldom ever got out of the house. After 2 weeks, then we were moved. Well, this was the owner of the bar. This is Jean Vialot on the right, his wife Francine. They had been married, I think, about 2 weeks when I arrived there, and my friend arrived. And her sister, Yvonne, were the ones that kept us there for the 2-week period. So after that time, we moved again to the Hotel Tournebride, and we stayed on the 3rd floor of the hotel, courtesy of the manager, Joseph and Alice Guyen. Joseph had been in the Merchant Marine, had been to the United States several times, spoke very little English, if any, and was sympathetic to the cause, and therefore sheltered us. 2 more weeks at the hotel, they decided to move us again, and we went to the town of Languenet, where Elieu Germain met us, and then he escorted us out into the country to a small farmhouse inhabited by a little old lady and her 2 sons. And this is Louis Lenoir, and his son Baptiste had been waiters down in Grenoble in a very high-class joint. Now they were hiding out in the country to keep from being sent to Germany as a forced laborer. This is their mother. She was 94 years of age at the time. I just love this picture. I think it's a classic. Then we were taken to, a little truck came to pick us up after the 4th day by Michel Lecren, who was a barber in the village of Gorin, and we missed the train. So he's got 5 of us finally, and in gathering us together, we were separated. He couldn't find some of us, so we missed the train that day. He had to put us up overnight. Fortunately, we got a haircut on. Then we got on the train the second day and we rode to the town of Guingamp. Now this is supposedly about an hour's run, but it took us about 3 hours. The German troops were on the front 4 or 5 cars of the train, and there was nobody on the back but people that had been in the country scrounging for food. And as we arrived in the town of Guingamp, the railroad station is up at the top of the picture. We were met by a guide with a newspaper under his arm. We followed him down the street, and they took us to the home of the gendarme, Monsieur Laurent. And Monsieur Laurent's house was just down the street from German headquarters. German headquarters was in the break of the wall up on there on the left. We would sit in the window above the garage and watch the German troops going by. For 2 days we were there until people came. That one night, Francois Calaveron came in his little Gazogen, which was a charcoal burning truck rigged up. It was a regular truck rigged up to burn charcoal. They came and they listened to the BBC at 7 o'clock. And of course, I, not speaking any French at the time, knew nothing of what they were looking for or what they were saying. But the BBC broadcast a code message. Bonjour à tout le monde de la maison d'Alphonse. Good evening to everyone in the house of Alphonse. This meant that the British motor gunboat had departed from Dartmouth in the southern part of England and was headed across the channel. The mission was on, all systems are go. So with Francois was Georges Lecune, who was part of the resistance in Guingamp. And then Francois took us by truck about 25 kilometers to the town of Floua. And here Francois Leconnec was the chief of the réseau in Brittany, and he was under the direction of Lucien Dumais, the Canadian officer. And one of the workers in this group was Maria-Thérèse Le Calvet, who was a tireless worker. She escorted the airmen to the beach. She met them at the railroad station. She fed them in her home, kept them with her. She and her mother, I think, sheltered about 20 airmen in her home at one time. This is Jean Jiquel. Now, Jean Jiquel had a small farm right near the coast. And Jean and his wife, this was the last meeting place of the airmen. And when I went through there were 26 of us departing that coast, and we all met in La Maison d'Alphonse. There are no pictures of it. The Germans burned it down because they assumed that there was some activity going on. They couldn't hang anybody with it, so they just burnt the place down. Outside the Maison d'Alphonse, there was a field, and Joe Benguy, who had been a he had been a merchant marine captain. Joe and his friend Pierre Huet spent 2 days on their hands and knees searching out the mines on the path between the Maison d'Alphonse and the beach. They had all the mines located. They put little sticks there. There were 19 of them. And when they would go out at night on a mission, they put white handkerchiefs there so that those of us who were following knew where the mines were. When we had departed, they would come back and pick up the handkerchiefs. And every time they'd go out, they'd put out 19 handkerchiefs, and they'd come back and they'd make sure they'd pick up 19. I was just in France 2 weeks ago, and they told me the story that after the liberation, they brought German prisoners of war in to dig up the mines. They dug up 20. This was the beautiful beach in western France where the motor gunboat came in to pick us up. This is the cliff that we all came down and we sat on the rocks on the right-hand side of the picture, looking out to the ocean, no moon, no stars, pitch black, German coastal defense batteries on either side. And when the batteries opened fire, it was like daylight, and we thought sure as hell that they'd sunk our boat out there. But no, after about 3 hours, the boat finally came. Little rowboats came in on the swell, and we climbed on board. The British sailors rowed us out about a mile or so at sea to pick up MGB 503. And the 503 boat was the one used in most of these missions, and it was a high-speed boat, pretty well armed. And en route back to England, we ran into 6 German E-boats, and the guy said, come on, we were all below deck. And they said, well, come on up, you want to see a good show up here. We said, the hell with that noise. So we out-evaded the German E-boats, and 4 hours later we ended up in the town of Dartmouth in southern England, safe and sound. Now, when we got back, we started to learn a little bit about what happened. We had a picture taken of the 5 of us. How did that happen? In any event, these are the 5 that were together. We came out on separate nights. 2 came out in March 18th, 2 on March 20th, 1 on it, I think, later, so we did all get on. But then my mother received a telegram at that, after I had been back in England 2 weeks, and all they knew was I was back on duty, back on active. Big deal. Everybody was thrilled to know that. I found out that we had been in the hands of Réseau Shelburne. And I also found out that Réseau Shelburne was headed by Lucien Dumais, Sergeant Major, Fusiliers Montreal, and he had been captured at Dieppe, got off the, jumped off the train, made his way to southern France, and escaped from southern France by the Pat O'Leary escape line. I'll tell you a little bit more about it later. Second in command was Raymond Labrosse, who was a radio operator. Raymond Labrosse had been in France earlier as part of the Val Williams line, and that was compromised, and he had to flee out of France over the Pyrenees Mountains, came back into England, volunteered to go back into France to help set up Réseau Shelburne, which turned out to be the most successful operation of its kind of World War II. They never lost an agent, they never lost a package. MI9 was the vehicle behind all of this. We didn't know it at the time, but this was Brigadier Norman Crockett, who was in charge of all the E&E operations. They set up things. He was ably assisted by a chap by the name of Harry Neve, who became a member of Parliament and a member of Margaret Thatcher's government, and lost his life in a bomb in the parking garage at the Parliament. In addition to that, Jimmy Langley, who lost an arm at Dunkirk, and he wanted to stay in the Army, stayed in the intelligence service and worked in setting up MI9. And the American intelligence sections worked with MI9, and perhaps Dorothy Smith will tell you more about that later. But in anything, there was the Pat O'Leary line. Pat O'Leary was a doctor, and he lived in the south of France and operated, while he was sort of commissioned as a first lieutenant in the Royal Navy, and so he operated the trawler, the Tirana, which came out towards Marseille and brought a lot of airmen out by the southern coast of France by sea, which was early on in the war. So Pat O'Leary turned out to be Major General Albert Garis of the Belgian Medical Corps. He has since died within the last 3 or 4 years. Then there was the Val Williams line. This was under the direction of Vladimir Boryashkin, and the line was broken in June of '43 when its leader and a party of airmen were arrested near Paul in the shadow of the Pyrenees Mountains. Raymond Labrosse was second in command. He was in Paris when he learned that his leader, Val Williams, had been arrested, and with the help of the Burgundy line, he returned to England, and then 6 months later, he came back to France as second in command of Shelburne. This is Val Williams, or Vladimir Boryashkin. He was a Russian Jew born in the United States. Was a great basketball player. Then there was a Burgundy line. Now, the Burgundy line was under the leadership of Georges Brossy, a free French officer, and they successfully evacuated 225 men over the Pyrenees through Andorra into Spain. This was the Georges Brossy. Drew Tartare was an American movie star in Paris, and when the Germans took over, she decided to stay, and she worked with the Burgundy line. Then there was the Dutch Paris network, and I think you might hear more about some of the operations of that later. But this was headed by John Henry Widener, who worked with the World Council of Churches in Geneva, Dr. Wisterhoff, and this is our panelist, Dr. Gabriel Nahas, who was in the Toulouse area and aided airmen that came down that way. Gilbert Beaujolin was in Paris, and there were several other people in the Dutch Paris. The evasion of airmen from the south part of France took many routes. One of them was through the little country of Andorra. The Comet line everybody knows about because of Madame Brusselmans, and of course some of our visits by members of the Comet line to some of our meetings, for example in Cincinnati. But this was headed at a later date. It was founded by Dédé's father, Arnold Dupay, and when that line was compromised, Dédé took over and became the celebrated hero of the Comet line, the Petit Cyclone, Dédé Dejean. In the south was Jean-Francois Nothomb. Franco was his code name. Franco operated as the anchor point of the comment line coming from the Belgian down through Paris down into the south of France. Then they had Florentino was the Basque guide that was used to a great extent by the comet line. Florentino knew the paths over the mountains, and he led many an aviator over the mountains. Perhaps somebody in this room, I don't know. This was the rugged Pyrenees Mountains that these guys had to navigate at one time or another. I hope somebody will tell you more about the perils of the crossing these mountains into Spain. This was a group of airmen that got caught going across in the spring before the snows had melted that much. They had to go past German observation points, cross raging rivers in the springtime. Several people were lost in the rivers when they couldn't hold their footing. This was Donald Darling in the British intelligence agent in Gibraltar. So those that got into Spain had to make contact through the embassies and through the agents in Spain, and they eventually ended up in Gibraltar to get back to England. This was not without cost. These are a list of some of the comment line members who were lost to the German Gestapo or the SS. Many books have been written about escape and evasion, and I'm just going to show you a few of them. This is Jimmy Langer's book. This was Women in the Resistance was a book that AFES cooperated with Dr. Rossiter for several years in publishing this book. We wanted to ensure that the women of the resistance got their proper due. This is before we learned to not be male chauvinists. This book tells its own story. This is a book by Harry Dolph, the editor of our AFES newsletter. This is by your own Jack Elfrey, who is a member of the board of directors of the 8th Air Force Historical Society. This is a book that was written by Madame Anne Brusselmans many moons ago. She's probably surprised that I have it, but I do. And she is rewriting it, so stand by for a great public announcement. This is the book by Clayton David, who is now president of AFES and who will be a member of your panel very shortly here, as soon as I shut up. And last but not least, this is a book by Yvonne de Ritter Files, and by sheerest of coincidence, Art Swanson has a few of them at the PX that he'd be very happy to sell you, and Yvonne might be very happy to sit there and autograph them for you this afternoon sometime or tomorrow. So that's the story of Ralph Patton, AFES, escape and evasion, and now we should get to the interesting part of the program, and we would like to have the lights back on, if you please. Now I'd like to bring our panelists up. We have them all seated in the front row here, and we wanted them to see the show also, so now we'll bring them up. And I'm going to bring them up in no specific order as far as the seat of only 4 living survivors out of 300. Charlotte Amba. I would now like to ask Yvonne de Ritter Files to come up, please. Yvonne now lives in Topanga, California. Yvonne de Ritter joined the resistance in Antwerp, Belgium in February 1941, working as a secretary and as a courier for the General Sabotage Group of Belgium, known as Group G. She later was involved in sabotaging German vehicles and distributing mimeographed underground publications. She started providing shelter to evading Allied airmen in the spring of 1943. Arrested by the SS in late 1944, she was sentenced to be hanged. She was freed when the advancing Allied armies liberated Antwerp. Yvonne de Ritter Files, now living in Englewood, New Jersey, is a Kentucky colonel appointed by the governor of Kentucky several years ago. So all you Kentuckians, salute your colonel. Dr. Nahas would probably rather be talking about his current war, He is one of the world's authorities on the effects of the drug culture and the effect of drugs on the human body. He feels that this war he's fighting is very important for our children and our grandchildren. But during the war, he was operating in the region of Toulouse, France. He started working with the resistance in 1941 by printing and distributing a clandestine newspaper. He was arrested in December 1941 and held for 2 months. He was released for lack of proof, but from May of 43, he worked with the Dutch Paris line, evacuating Dutch and Belgian officers from Switzerland into Spain. After November 1943 until June 1944, he was involved in organizing convoys of airmen out of Toulouse into Spain. He also worked with Francois Desarts, who had taken over after the arrest of Pat O'Leary and the Pat O'Leary line. They were helping British and American airmen to evade capture. His citation for the Medal of Freedom with gold palm reads, "He was responsible for the escape into Spain of more than 200 Allied evaders and for the organization of a vast underground escape net which aided the U.S. in the war against the enemy." Dr. Gabriel Nahas. He used to call him Big George, but anyhow, his name is Hank, H-E-N-K-E, Little George. But he won't acknowledge if you call him Hank. But George Van Remmerdam worked with the Dutch underground in the Biesbach. He helped the invaders avoid being captured there, and primarily started out helping the Jewish people that were hunted by the Germans. The Biesbach is a 100-mile square watershed of shapeless swamp feeding the Merwede River in the southwestern Holland. Only the area natives knew their way through this swampy maze. The Germans patrolled major waterways, but hesitated to travel the back channels frequented by the underground. He commanded a small group of resistance fighters who scrounged food from black marketeers and collaborating farmers. He was active with explosives and was sabotaging German facilities. George Van Remmerdam. President of the APs right now. He's from Hannibal, Missouri. He was a co-pilot with the 303rd Bomb Group. He was shot down on January the 11th, 1944 over Holland. He traveled from Amsterdam to Maastricht, to Brussels, to Paris, to Toulouse, and he crossed over the Pyrenees Mountains and eventually ended up in Pamplona, Spain. After traveling by car to Madrid, he was put on a train to Gibraltar. Returned to England by C-47 on 25 May 1944. Clayton C. David. Mr. Lee Gordon. I never knew his name was Lee, but Shorty Gordon, come on up. Shorty now lives in Australia, and he came here for this symposium, and he's going back within a few days. But Shorty was a gunner with the 305th Bomb Group. He was shot down on the 26th of February 1943 near Wilhelmshaven. He was taken prisoner and sent to Dulag Luth, then to Stalag 8B, Stalag 7A, 5A, 5B. After 2 unsuccessful escape attempts, he succeeded on the 3rd try, and he traveled by train across Germany into France, made contact with the underground in France, and escaped by way of Réseau Shelburne's Operation Bonaparte. Shorty Gordon is, to our knowledge, the only American airman ever to escape from a German POW camp in Germany and return to England prior to D-Day. Shorty Gordon, San Antonio, Texas. He's a rated officer, but he was acting in the command capacity when he flying a mission on the 22nd of February 1944. He flew with the 303rd Bomb Group, and he landed near Duffel, Belgium, and made his way to Switzerland. He escaped back into France, intending to cross the Pyrenees into Spain. Established contact with the French resistance group at Avignon in southeast central France, and he organized a battalion of Maquis who were primarily engaged in interdiction of railroads and bombing of railroads. He remained with the Maquis until September 1944, when the U.S. 7th Army liberated the area. Colonel George Weinbrenner spent his career with the intelligence service, retired several years ago as a full colonel. Now I'd like Dorothy Smith Hunting to come up. Dorothy Smith was WAC captain in the intelligence service in England. Many of our members met her during the war and were interrogated by her. She has a lot of interesting things to tell us. Captain Smith was located in PW&X headquarters on Brook Street at the end of the war. Was responsible for interrogating a number of evading airmen. After the liberation of Paris, she moved to Paris to help organize the recognition and the awarding of medals to deserving members of the underground who helped America's airmen. Dorothy Smith Hunting. Dorothy. That's all from me. You have heard too much already, and I now turn the meeting over to our dear friend, Roger Freeman, who will conduct the symposium. Thank you.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, we'll now have the stories of the individuals who are up here, the panelists. And I think we'll start with the gentleman right at the end on my right, George Ramadan. And in fact, I must apologize that my Anglo-Saxon pronunciation may play havoc with some of these names. But I think you know who I mean. And I apologize for missing out the van. I've just been reminded. So that's a very good start. But if you'll forgive me, George, would you like to tell us your story, or as much as you can, within about 5 minutes?
Good. Can you hear me? You've heard how several airmen were escorted by us. I did some of that too with a girl by the name of Jan. But we also did something else that some of you might not know about. I think all of you have heard of Market Garden, that started, I think, the 17th of September in 1944, when the planned by Montgomery, when they called it the One Bridge to Far, I think, because it went not the way it was supposed to go. Some of you guys made it back, some of them did not. Some of them were wounded and were taken to a hospital in Utrecht. And I was doing my work in between Utrecht and Arnhem, not too far from Utrecht anyway. So we got, some of the wounded were treated there, and after the wounds were healed, they were sent back to Germany in a prisoner of war camp. We got some information and contact with the administration of the hospital and also the one that kept the books, and when they were about to be sent to Germany, instead they scattered them out of the books and we picked them up on our bicycles and took them out of Utrecht to a place where they would later be cast or stay there till the end of the war. So one day we took out, the girl and I, we took out 2 Americans, 2 British and 1 Dutchman. Normally we would take a road through farmland, so we wouldn't meet too many Germans on the way back. So this day we got kind of lost in Utrecht, and we exited Utrecht, and the main road to Arnhem, but there was a lot of German traffic. So I stopped, I was taking the film, then came the 2 Americans, then the girl, 2 Englishmen, and then the Dutchman at the end. So I said, what shall we do? Should we go back and find the old road, or shall we keep going? We decided to keep going. We went towards a city like Zeist. Nothing happened. We turned left to take a back road from there. The Americans followed me. The 2 English and the girl followed me. The Dutchman didn't see us turn left, and he kept going. We already knew that the Dutchman had been parachuted into France earlier that year or the year before and worked with the Marquis in France. So he knew a little bit about the Marquis. And apparently they had a battle song, and he knew about that battle song. The girl that worked with me, Jan, she also knew that battle song, but it was coming handy later. We brought the 2 Americans and the 2 British to the place where we supposed to bring them, and then the girl went back and traced the road where the Dutchman had gone. She rode about 10 kilometers on her bicycle and kept whistling the song, the battle song of the Marquis. Anyway, a song that she knew the Dutchman knew also.
And all of a sudden, out of the bush on the side of the road that was dark already, he came back to say whistle. And he found the guy that way and brought him back to the place he was supposed to go. So it was quite an exciting story. Well, we had many of them, but I get only 5 minutes, so.
Thank you, George Van Remmenden. Actually, he didn't even have his 5 minutes, but all the same, good tale, and I'm sure he'll tell us more later on. Now let's go to the other end of the spectrum, so to speak, and talk to one of those who escaped. Clayton David, would you like to tell us how you made it home?
How many men out there remember 11 January 1944? The raids on Ossersleben, Brunswick, Halberstadt. It was a pretty deadly day. I happened to be a member of the 303rd. That night, we had 109 empty beds in my base. And just to give you a little perspective, and sometimes we had fairly good percentage of people evade. But when I returned to my base, the 25th of May, I was the only man that made it out of 109. The majority, of course, we know later, were killed in action. Large numbers became prisoners of war. Well, after 2.5 hours of constant air battle, we were on our way home, and oh boy, when you began to get back around the Zuider Zee, you got back around Amsterdam, you thought it couldn't be too many more minutes. Well, we had 2 engines out, and the number 2 gas tank on fire, and it began to blaze pretty heavy, and it looked like it was the time to give up the ghost, and we did. I was flying co-pilot, and at 15,000 feet, I bailed out. I am here to tell this story today primarily for the Thanksgiving of my helpers, and also to those unsung heroes like the paratrooper who came to our base and told us what to expect on bailout, on our very first bailout. Well, to make a long story short on this, I was the only man in our crew that landed on land. There was a 30-yard strip that existed between the Zuider Zee and Kingsmere Lake. I had calculated that the cloud cover was at about 3,000 feet, and that's what we were flying above. And so I decided I would wait till I went into the cloud stoke my parachute, and I did. When I opened my parachute, I immediately bounced out and fell at the bottom, and I had less than 500 feet of ceiling. But I looked, and I could see nothing but water, and finally, on a second look, I could see a little strip of land. And that was the side of the deck of the Zuider Zee and a little pathway along Kingsmere Lake. The paratrooper had said that when you want to go some direction, pull the shroud lines on that side. I did. It was my one and only jump, and it was letter perfect. Now, I don't know what happens in some of these things, but I tell you, I've heard about some of the comments of those of us who went to war and so on. But if you've never found God, I think you will in critical conditions. I don't know what happened, but as quick as I began to get out of my parachute and throw it into the water, took off my flight boots and filled them with water to sink it and so on, I couldn't see where to go. Here I was on a narrow strip of land. Which way do I go? A man came riding by on a bicycle, and he pointed. I went that direction. Having been back there several times since, I'd gone in the opposite direction, and I walked right into a little village and been arrested. Now, I don't know where that man came from, but he was there when I needed him. And I hid out in the drainage ditch until it was dark enough to move, or I thought it was, and then I immediately had help from a farm. Now, to show you that these things also had parts, I've since learned that there were two brothers. One of them was sympathetic to what the Germans were doing. The other one helped me. The other one that was sympathetic ended up in Poland a few weeks later with the German army. When he returned to Holland, he was not welcome, and he shipped off to Brazil. But it was the first night that I found very, very tough, wondering, I knew I was alive, but did my folks, who would get the message? I'm sure it's the thoughts that run through the minds of many in this crowd. But anyway, I also was interrogated by a man at this first farmhouse that did a beautiful job. I've since learned that he was a German. He worked for the Reuter News Service. He was a reporter. Living in Holland, he had become impressed with their activities, and he became sympathetic to them, and he helped me in the interrogation and did a thorough job. Well, anyway, I got into the underground organization. They took me into Amsterdam to Venlo, Venlo to Maastricht, and Maastricht to Brussels, and later Brussels to Paris, and in Paris our group, and incidentally I was on Dr. Nehos's Dutch-Paris line into Paris, but the group ahead of me was shot up in the mountains of Toulouse, and we were detained too long, and the people helping us were arrested. And so 8 of us, we broke up in pairs. 2, incidentally, out of the 8 ended up coming out through Shelbourne. 2 of us went across the Pyrenees, the other 4, 2 of which had escaped from the Germans in Holland, ended up going to prison camps. Now, I'm going to tell you a couple of little incidents. I don't know how many of you people were familiar with riding on trains when you were flying. Riding on trains in Europe, I sure didn't. No, I didn't know any better. My first train ride, I was given a ticket, and when I got off the train at Venlo, 1 mile from the German border, following my guide, I thought they were looking for passports. Now, I had a fake passport, and I had it in my pocket. I had never thought about the fact that they'd never picked up my ticket. They think you're honest over there, and you collect that ticket that you get off. And so we were all marching off of the train and turning in the tickets, and I was within 5 feet, and I saw the man wasn't taking tickets, and I had my hand on my passport. So what do? I just flashed my passport in front of his face and walked right on. He thought I was some member of the Gestapo, I guess, right pretty fast. But in Paris, we had to break up, and the other man and myself, Ken Shaver from 388 Bomb Group, we traveled then into southern France on our own, and we again learned a lot about riding trains. It wasn't all successful, but it turned out all right. And we finally ended up in the mountains of central France, where some people helped us, later put us in touch with a group of the Maquis, and we were sent there for a period of time, received parachute drops at night, and then they were distributed in arms and ammunition. Well, when a couple came out to take us into Toulouse on a Sunday afternoon to go to Pau the following day, they didn't want us to waste any travel time, so they gave each of us 2 suitcases. We carried, and I don't think too many did this, we carried 2 suitcases into Toulouse, 2 apiece, and they were filled with hand grenades, machine guns, whatever ammunition and so forth that was to be distributed. So that turned out to be a little interesting experience. Then we went to Pau, and Pau went out into the mountains and had a Basque guide. And of course, that's a forbidden zone that you got into out there. The only people that had a right to be in the zone lived in the zone, and that was the treacherous area. I've since learned there were 4 of us crossed together, and that composition of 4 was Ken Shaver, the airman that was with me, a French courier who had been dropped in, made his delivery and his contacts, walked through the mountains into Spain, back to back to England, and he was on his third trip. The fourth person was a Spanish deserter from the Civil War who had hidden out in France and was on his way back to Spain, and he paid his own way. And so it was kind of an interesting tie-in. I have since learned that of those of us who made it to the foot of the Pyrenees, which we thought was quite an achievement, that there was somewhere between 1/2 and 2/3 of us that got through into Spain. The rest either were captured or something happened to them. And some good percentage just were not physically able to make it and gave it. I ran over, excuse me.
Thank you, Clayton, very much indeed. And now we'll turn to this charming lady on my right, Yvonne de Ryder-Files, and learn how she came so close to death in Belgium all those years ago. Yvonne.
Ladies and gentlemen, before anything else, let me tell you, gentlemen of the 8th Air Force, that the sight of your squadron after squadron of bombers flying high up in the sky over my home in Antwerp, Belgium, on their way to bomb Germany, filled me with such excitement and feeling of gratefulness toward you. Give it to them, boys, give it to them, was our cry. My husband, Lieutenant Colonel Roger Files, U.S. Air Force career officer, fighter pilot, now retired, who is here with me, is not, as so many assume, one of those I hid in my home in Antwerp. No, he didn't fly out of England. He was fighting in the Mediterranean theater and earned many medals, including the Silver Star. I was involved, as you have heard, since January 1941 in espionage. Then sabotage, as a member of the General Sabotage Group of Belgium, known as Group G, storing and delivering explosives to the men whenever and wherever they were needed. You can easily imagine that I had several close calls. But the biggest thrill in my 3.5 years of resistance work was in the last year, sheltering Allied airmen. The first delivery consisted of 2 Royal Air Force and 1 Royal Canadian Air Force. Now, before I go any further, it is important I give you a sketch of my location. My apartment was on the top floor of a 3-story home, 1 block away from 3 connecting magnificent parks, a beautiful residential area on the outskirts of Antwerp. Now, the Germans thought so too, judging by the fact that they occupied many of the big apartment houses all around me. So the coming and going of the Luftwaffe personnel was constant on the sidewalk below. I have a photo I treasure and which is reproduced in my book, which shows my 3 first evaders standing at my picture window, watching from behind the curtains the Luftwaffe personnel on that sidewalk. The second flyboys entrusted to my care consisted of 1 New Zealander, RAF fighter pilot Max McGregor, and Lou Rabinovitz of New York, U.S. Air Force. 2 magnificent subjects for a study in differing human characteristics. Max McGregor, very reserved, a little shy maybe, perfect gentleman. Lou, the typical New Yorker, I guess. Extrovert, joker, he was a riot. During his stay, he brought me the most laughter of my 4 years of German occupation. Of course, another joy was my reunion with Lou 11 years later in February 1955 on the This Is Your Life show. Ralph Edwards, the producer, had read an article relating the ceremony at the British Consulate General, where I was awarded the King's Medal for Courage in the Cause of Freedom bestowed upon me by the Queen. He immediately had sprung into action, and 3 weeks later, under a false pretense, here I was at the El Capitan Theater in Hollywood, taken out of the audience, brought on stage. Ralph Edwards brought on as surprises on the show 3 of the airmen I had sheltered, among them Lou Rabinovich. There were, of course, unusually exciting moments too. For instance, when, to calm the nerves of 2 evaders who had been stopped by the Gestapo and asked for their identity papers just as they drove into my street, I took them that evening for a walk through the park. As I mentioned before, these parks were just 1 short block from my apartment. By the way, these 2 men, in addition to the anxiety of the encounter with the Gestapo at my corner, had, in the shelter where they came from somewhere in Brussels, been obliged for 5 days to remain locked up in 1 room, forbidden to move around, and could only speak in a whisper. So you can imagine their nerves were understandably quite raw. Now picture us 3, walking arm in arm down the narrow park lane and constantly crossing paths with Luftwaffe personnel who greeted us with "Guten Abend, Guten Abend," as they passed by. Well, we 3 returned the courtesy with our own "Guten Abend." The comic of the situation brought laughter to the boys and a return to a comparative calm. The day I was notified by a breathless resistance emissary that I had been betrayed and that, quote, they would come to arrest me in an hour, I had 5 airmen in my home. I have only 5 minutes, so can't go into it here. It is all detailed, of course, in my book. But as you can imagine, this was one of my most dramatic moments. I don't think the shock here was even surpassed by the one the day of my actual arrest. Several weeks later, after having been in hiding, the Germans did catch up with me, and I was arrested. I was placed in solitary confinement, but taken out daily for interrogation. No need for me to go into details about these. You have read many accounts of them. I was condemned to be hanged, but thanks to the swift advance of the Allied forces, was liberated 10 days before the execution day, giving me the pleasure of being here with you today. Thank you.
What a marvelous lady. Now we'll go to the other side again, to somebody who was a member of the U.S. Air Force, U.S. Forces in this case, George Weinberger. Once again, I apologize if my pronunciation is not quite as you would wish, but George, tell us your experiences in those long gone days.
Thank you very much, Rob. Can you hear me? I'm certainly honored to be here, and like my friend Clayton, my main purpose in accepting was to give public thanks, public recognition. Closer? Okay. To give public recognition to the French and the Belgian people who were responsible for my being able to be here today with you. Like our friend here on the right, I got shot down on the way back from Oschersleben. Shot down over in Belgium. I spent only 1 night in Belgium. Belgian people were very, very kind and got me out of Belgium very, very quickly into France. I had a little bit of advantage because I spoke quite good French at that time, still do, and a little bit of German. And like our good friend here, Stone Christopher, without him we wouldn't have had any escape organization on the American side. But he was very, very good in following the advantage the British did at AI-9. He kept the thing going. I got into Paris, France, all right, in February of '44, and things were very, very rough there. The Germans were getting quite beastly, quite nervous about the oncoming invasion. They knew it. And so it was very, very dangerous in there. I'd like to recall just one story to show the type of people that the French people were there. I was getting pretty hungry, pretty cold. I took a chance and I saw a gendarme, an old man, and he had on his lapel the ribbons of World War I. So I went up to him and I told him I was an American. I was hungry. He looked at me. said, follow me. I didn't know whether he would take me to the police station or the Germans, but no, he took me to an old flat, took me upstairs. His wife was there. They fed me what they could, and she took some warm water and washed off my feet, which were almost freezing. And after I was feeling a little better, I said to him, you know, you took a terrible chance. I could have been a German, posing. And he said, yes, you could. But if we'd have found out later that you actually were an American, and we had refused you help, we would have died of embarrassment. That was the type of people we had. Well, carrying on, I was able to get on a train, and I went down to the Swiss frontier, and knowing the language and having toured the country before the war, I got into Switzerland, all right, and I got on the telephone from the local priest and called the U.S. Embassy in Bern. Boy, I thought, I've got it made. And I talked to a young attaché at the embassy, and I told him who I was, and I said, come and get me. And he said, you are instructed to go to the Swiss police, turn yourself in, and you'll be interned at Montreux for the rest of the war. I didn't believe what I was hearing. So I told him in under certain words that what I thought of his ancestry. Turned around, talked to this old Swiss priest, and I said, I'm going to head back and try to get to the Pyrenees. And he said, God bless you, son. I don't think you'll make it, but you ought to try. So went back, and sure enough, on the way back into France, the French police picked me up. And they were curious as all hell about me. And they threw me in a dungeon. I was in that damn thing for about a week. But they were feeding me pretty well. And I thought, oh, there's something wrong here, see? And kept telling them that I was an American. Well, they didn't believe that. But they fed me pretty well. And they took my shoes away. You know, I thought you'd go out in the layup. And finally, on the 7th or 8th day, a young Frenchman came in, dressed in the uniform of the Alpine Chasseurs. He was a lieutenant. And he asked me a few questions, and I answered correctly, and he stood up and saluted and said, welcome to France. Well, things were getting still worse, so I was advised by this lieutenant to try to head for the central of France, where Clayton was there. And I did. I went down to Auvergne, right into the Massif Central, and I thought I'd run into a lot of the resistance people. Well, unfortunately, in that mountainous region, they weren't very, very well organized. And I had no trouble getting food or getting help from any of the local people, primarily farm people, peasants, but they were no organized thing at all. One day, I got a message from one of the Frenchmen, and he said, there's either a British or an American up in the next village, East-Loire, not too far from here. And I said, you sure he's British or American? He said, we don't know. So I went up, and outside a little beach where it was, I listened to him speaking, and he was speaking French, but sure as hell wasn't an Englishman. At least it didn't sound like it. And sure enough, when the guy came on, I grabbed him, and it turned out to be an OSS officer by the name of René Dussac. He was killed later. And he was an Argentine serving in the U.S. OSS. So I asked him if he could get a message back to England for me. And he said, yes. He said, I can talk to Allied Force headquarters. And all I wanted to do was let my mother and father know I was safe. About 3 days later, he came to me and said, here's the message. And it said, you are instructed to remain in situ, render assistance, and organize the local maquis. I said, oh, well, it's an official order. That was it. And a few days later, they brought a Britisher to him. You saw his picture tonight. Ralph had it, Harry Knee. And he was one of the heroes of heroes. And I talked with him for a while, and he said, oh, yes, you got to organize this maquis. So I did the best I can. And here's the remainder of what I have from the maquis. I had a uniform for the French Foreign Legion. And I still use this cap. When I go to France fairly frequently, I leave it at the top of my suitcase, and the French customs, when they open it up, they see that, they salute. Anyhow, we did try to organize a Maquis battalion, and because of my language ability, I was able to get them together. These were farm boys. Two factions, the FFI, the French, these were the de Gaullist boys. The other were the FTD, the communists. But there was very little difference between any of them because they were just local kids. We had no ammunition. We had practically nothing, but it was that area of France, there was a lot of mining going on, coal mining and whatnot, so we could get explosives. We could steal ammunition from the Germans and from the French police, the French police, and things like that. And so we were able to do something. Now Ralph had asked me to talk about the resupply of the Maquis by the 8th Air Force. Well, unfortunately, the area I was in, we didn't get any, nothing. But in this month's magazine, which you all have gotten, there is an article on the carpetbaggers. It's pretty well done. And they talk in this article about the Battle of the Margarine in central France. Well, I had my battalion in that battle, and they suggested this thing that we lost the battle because they were betrayed, the French were betrayed. I don't think that actually was the case, although I can't document it. I think the Germans were highly efficient in their intelligence. They knew what was coming. They brought in there what the French called a division blindée, armored division of Wapet SS. And boy, oh boy, those are real SOBs. And they were terrible, terrible. So they shot up everything, so we had to beat it up. But anyhow, I had to scatter my unit, and by that time, getting close to September, the French B Army and the 7th Army, 6th Army were coming up the Rhone Valley, and I finally was able to join them in just outside of Lyon, France, and was able to get back to England through a circuitous route. I didn't have the pleasure of being interrogated with this lovely lady here. I guess they thought I wasn't worth it. That was it. But I would like to just make one comment. The French and the British people and the Belgian people that helped me and helped others, unbelievable. And I would be very, very proud if under similar circumstances, our people would act the same way. I think they would. Thank you.
Thank you, George. You mentioned interrogation, so let's turn now to Dorothy Smith and Keith. Can you tell us what it was like dealing with these young men when they returned to England? What did you learn and how did they behave?
What it was like was exciting and very pleasant, and I feel dreadful being here, having lived a very safe, comfortable life all during the war. I started out with no one knowing why on earth I was there. I'd never worked for a newspaper, and everybody who was going over in this group had worked for a newspaper. I did speak some French, and I had gone to school in Europe, and nobody thought that was very important. And I found out toward the end of the war that of the 5 people he chose, I was one of the 2 that he got. I got there and went to work reorganizing the file. I'd been trained as a company commander, and the office was in chaos. And I put that in order and found all the correspondence with French underground. So I translated that and turned that in. And we got casualty lists every day, the day after. Very garbled lists. And Major Nelson would look at them, and finally, we didn't know what to do with him. And finally, he started throwing them across the table at me and saying, "You have to organize things. Do what you want with these." I didn't know what to do with them. But it was the Air Force that had gone down the day before. So I'd start, and they went off to play darts before lunch, and I don't play darts. As a tribute to the boys, I started reading these lists aloud every day as a tribute to them as best I could, because it was a real mess. Smith could be spelled with 2 Q's and a Z. And at the end it turned out, it was really awful. But in the end, from those, I had a phenomenal memory, which I no longer have at that time. And I used to have, I'd say to the boys, I had an advantage over you, I had feminine intuition. And it was very good at somehow or other deciphering those lists. Whenever there was any message about any of the men who were down or they were coming back and they wanted identification as to whether or not they were Americans or Germans and that sort of thing, that list became absolutely invaluable because I could look at a bunch of Q's and Z's and I don't know how. I could say, sure, look, this is this, don't you see how this whole crew fits together? They went down together on that date. And they were ours. And twice I had to make the decision about whether they were Americans or Germans with absolutely nothing. But the first one, no, because they'd gone down in North Africa, so nobody, they came from North Africa, they'd gone down in south of France, so nobody in England knew anything about them. But I've been struck by the fact that I didn't know anything about the outfit when the casualty list had come through. And one of the names, which turned out not to be garbled, I thought was the most garbled of all, but I used to repeat them aloud to myself, you see. So when these came through, that these were not Americans, I was able to run screech and say, hold everything, these are Americans, I know that they are. They flew out of North Africa, and they were. And last night, Mrs. David was able to let me know that their pilot was a member of the organization here. The other time when I just did it on Luck and a Prayer, I couldn't see how I could have all of those names almost right there together. But every time that the people in France thought they were Germans. And every time that we'd tell them, ask them what they had for breakfast, because we knew exactly what they'd had for breakfast. They would always come back with the wrong answer, and they refused to change it. You couldn't convince them to. And I finally decided it was the right answer. And it was. A girlfriend had given them eggs, and they were the only ones in the outfit who had had eggs for breakfast. But they thought we were very smart and intelligent, so we knew that they had eggs for breakfast, and that's the answer we wanted. It was not. But it worked. So that first half of the war was spent on interrogation. The second half, we went over to France, and it was to decide on what recognition and compensation was to be given. And they were going to try to, some people didn't want money, they had lots, but some people had suffered great hardships when they weren't in an organized line, you see, that could get money and that sort of thing. Also, what are we going to do for decorations? The French can give the Légion d'honneur à titre civil, so civilians can get it. And in England, they have the King's Orders. We had military decorations, period. So, think of the Air Force each year when the President gives out the Medal of Freedom. The Medal of Freedom and the Eisenhower Certificate of Appreciation came out of our office in France, working that out. And that was done so this country now has a decoration we can give for valor to civilians. And that was done. And that was, in many ways, maybe the most interesting thing. I had a lot of fun because we divided France into territories, and I got Brittany. And Brittany, the terrain lends itself to a lot of fighting, and there's a tremendous amount of resistance there. And, of course, Shelburne, where now I've been on that cliff that you showed the picture of. That was the only time. When I first went to Brittany, I went into the boss and I said, I don't own any slacks. Slacks came with our uniform. And I know that my French officer number always wears slacks. He said, walk around my desk. So I walked around and he said, just stick to your skirt. And the only time I regretted it was when I went down that cliff. The only time I ever needed it. But I did that. But it was wonderful, and what was so fantastic at the end of the war, when the Americans liberated Dachau, that so many of the top people in the resistance were still alive, had survived the heartbreak of the December when the Germans broke through. Battle of the Bulge. Because it looked as though they were invincible, and a lot of people, like my future husband, had seen all the craft lined up in England, and some, they even had a hard time getting through the disappointment of that. But when we liberated Dachau, you know what all those prominent resistors had to do was to escape from the Americans, because they had typhoid, and we quarantined them. And they all knew that if they lived there, if they stayed there, they'd die. They all went out back under the fence, and they came to us in Paris. And so many of the people who had fighting spirit did live through It was fantastic. And it was time for people to get awards and decorations and get married and go home. It's the end of the war for me.
Thank you, Dorothy. Now we'll go back to France again, to Dr. Gabrielle Nahas. Would you like to tell us your part in those difficult, dark days?
My friends from the mighty 8th Air Force. About 50 years ago, I was a second-year medical student in Toulouse, France. As a medical student, I was not drafted as all the fellows of my age. As a medical student, I was not drafted as all the fellows of my age who were sent to work in German factories or had to go into hiding. Toulouse is 80 miles away from the Pyrenees, the 10,000 feet mountain range between France and Spain. And I knew those mountains well, since mountain climbing was one of my hobbies. The Pyrenees were the main obstacle on the way to North Africa or Gibraltar in England. Toulouse, a city of 200,000 at that time, became the transit point of those who wanted to rejoin the Allied fighting forces. First in 1942, we were able to guide through familiar mountain passes a few special agents and most young Frenchmen who wanted to rejoin in England General de Gaulle. For us it was just a trek of a few days, but we came back. However, starting in 1943, Toulouse became the center of one of the escape routes for the surviving crews of Allied bombers, mostly from the 8th Army Air Force, who had been shot down over occupied Europe. These pilots and airmen who had risked their lives daily to deliver France were for us heroes falling from the skies. An increasing number of them came to a city which was occupied by 20,000 German soldiers, quite apparent everywhere in their green or grey uniforms, and not to mention the hundreds of snooping Gestapo agents and their informers, impossible to spot. So we had to get organized to assist our heroes. We called them, by the way, our packages for delivery. As a medical student, I pieced together a little group of trusted friends and fellow students, most eager to become helper of heroes under the guise of handling packages for special delivery. The young ladies were most adept in this task, probably because they are used to go shopping, and they were also much more numerous in the 18 to 21 age group. They were not called into service or sent to Germany. And they performed magnificently in our little network of volunteers who worked as tourist guides, conveyors, shoppers, cooks, interrogators, suppliers of food and clothing. I was also in contact with mountain guides, with whom I had scaled the Pyrenees, and one of my classmates became for us a full-time guide. His name was Charbonnier. Every 2 or 3 weeks, the same scenario unfolded. The curtain rose on the arrival in Toulouse of escapees sent to us and retrieved by word of mouth. They came singly or in groups of 4 or 5 from the Dutch Paris or Francois network. In the first act, they had to be retrieved and concealed from public view as soon as possible. They were so tall and so poorly clothed. You could spot them, if you had an eye for them. And they had to be placed in safe locations, often in attics and basements. They had to be fed and clothed, given boots. They also had to be screened for possible moles. And I remember one time there was this so-called French Canadian who came over all alone, and I had some second thought about him, so I put him with a group of true Americans. They had bailed out from the same plane, and I knew they were safe. And one day I came back and this man had disappeared. And I understood that he had disappeared in a violent fashion. Which required, as a matter of fact, the help of the farmer to make some holes. But most of the time, it was for the flyers, an idle and very tedious wait. Most of them kept quiet, I only heard once of a noisy altercation. It was in the winter of the election year of 1943, when a few fellows engaged in a bull session over FDR, and they woke up the landlord, who saw that the Gestapo were hurrying to enter his house. My friends, you were tall men telling tall jokes. One to be remembered is the tale of the giant flying fortress B-1000, which I didn't see in the maquettes that you have around here. Well, it had the size of an extended 747, and the pilot had to communicate with the tail gunner by dialing long distance. On one flight, communications were suddenly broken between the two, as the plane started to swerve up and down. The pilot sent a messenger on a motorcycle to the tail gunner. Minutes later, the cause of the turmoil was relayed back. A Messerschmitt had been caught in the fan of the tail compartment. Act 2 was to locate one of our elusive mountain guides and plan with him the safest way to take a convoy of 12 to 15 airmen to the Pyrenees. And we had to settle especially for P, or Passage Day. Then came Act 3, the assembling of the airmen at the railway station of Toulouse in the evening. They were escorted by conveyors and under the bored gaze of ubiquitous German soldiers. They were everywhere, those guys. They boarded overcrowded local trains to one of the small cities which was on the edge of the forbidden zone which Clayton spoke to you about. This was a 15-mile wide strip of mountains stretching parallel to the Pyrenees. It was occupied by 2 divisions of the Wehrmacht, and its access was forbidden for anyone not living there. When escapees had reached a selected small railroad station at nightfall, they left the train on the wrong side of the tracks. Indeed, our packages were then entrusted to the waiting mountain guides, driving his bicycle all over town or taking trains to keep in contact with our conveyors, our escorters, our suppliers, our messengers and guards, and also with the guys in the big positions in Switzerland where I had to go also. Because all of the communication had to be made by word of mouth. There was no telephone, no written messages, which made scheduling very difficult, of course. And our convoys, especially their departure, somewhat erratic. You can imagine what it was when you see the delays that we have on our airplanes today for leaving, sometimes several hours. It didn't go beyond several hours. The scenario I have just described was repeated until the eve of the Allied landing in Normandy, which I celebrated in Toulouse. But by then, the Gestapo had identified all of the members of our little network and moved in. 6 were shot, including our guide Charbonnier. As many were imprisoned. I managed to escape, and I'm one of the lucky survivors. But really, I think one should not put the shoe on the wrong foot. You were the heroes, because you were able to project a model. It was a model of a country which was fighting for what is right and what is decent. And this is an unending fight. It's today the fight of our children and grandchildren. And maybe they should be informed that in order to inherit the freedom of their fathers, they have to stand on the shoulders of their fathers and not step on their toes. Thank you very much.
I know that you agree with me, those are very fine sentiments, true as they come. Now we'll turn to another brave lady from Belgium, Charlotte Ambach.
I thought you might perhaps be interested in some of the stories with pilots, with crewmen that I had. Some of them that made life more difficult for us, and some that actually resulted in quite a bit of laughter and fun. And there was one story. I had to go and fetch some boys at the border, of the Dutch-Belgian border, and they had been picked up by Dutch people and brought to a baker in Bree, and in order to get there I had to take a train, and then a tram, and then partly on a bicycle, and partly to walk, and so on. And when I arrived, there were these 4 boys who had waited for quite a long time, and they gave me an absolutely fabulous welcome. They hoisted me up on their shoulders and danced around with me, and they nearly brained me against the ceiling. But, and then, so the next day I took them back again by bicycle, tram, and train to Brussels, and in the train I had them dispersed, and one of them was sitting in a compartment, and I told them when I pass by and blow my nose, you know that you have to get out, that is, when the moment came, the one who was in the compartment, he was fast asleep. So I said to another one, I said, can you go and get him? And so he went in and tried to wake him, and the first one, the one that was asleep, said, oh, what? In English, that was not exactly the best moment that I passed. I was a little bit afraid that might have bad consequences, but everything went fine. That was one. We had also a very bad moment at one time, that one of the airmen, there were 2, they were ported in an apartment, a nurse's apartment in Brussels, and they were all alone there. The nurse was, during the day, she stayed away there. She only went once a day, and one of them had started bleeding internally. Apparently he had either had a bleeding ulcer or stomach rupture when the opening parachute jerked him up, and something was wrong with him. We didn't quite know what to do. The nurse, thank goodness, she knew a doctor who actually put himself in double jeopardy. Not only that he was trying to help one of the airmen, but he was also Jewish. So, as I say, but he went there. He couldn't do very much for him. He tried to do whatever he could, because operating was, of course, out of the question. And we were not quite sure how well this young man was going to fare or not. And we, of course, had to think of the possibility that he might die, and what then to do with the body. And that was one of the very bad questions, and we just said, well, the only thing what we can do is take him out, leave him somewhere in the street, and then go away and let him be found because we could not go to authorities or anything to tell them about it. But there was also another small incident that was very funny, and that was an American airman who was at least 6 foot, if not more, tall, and he was terribly gung-ho. He was fighting the war and really wanted to show that he was a fighter. And at a certain moment, from our apartment window, he saw 2 German officers pass by in the street down there. And we had the worst time keeping him from getting out of the apartment, running down and killing these German officers. He really wanted to continue the war. We told him that that was not the best idea to do it where he was at that time. And there was another one that also was very amusing. Again, we had 4 boys, and one of them had a fairly big parcel under his arm, wrapped up in brown paper, and he wouldn't let that parcel out of his sight. And he was very worried, and that must have been terribly, terribly precious to him. And finally, we were very curious about it, and finally we couldn't stand it anymore. We asked, but what is in that parcel? The farmer who had picked him up had given him some wooden shoes, some gloves, Dutch wooden shoes. That was in the parcel. And then, and this is one of my boys who is sitting right here in the audience. We had them at the house, and I had to convey the four of them to another place where to stay and so on. And we got onto a tram, and we're passing the Palais de Justice in Brussels on the tram, and I saw a man who, to me, seemed suspicious, but he seemed to suspect us too. And he got off at the Palais de Justice after looking at us fairly disagreeably. And I said to the four boys, out we go, the stop after that we went out, and then I took them through all kinds of small streets so that we wouldn't be followed, and then finally we got onto a tram again and got to the destination. That is, well, I think that is about the stories I have here. And I also want to say there's one sound and one thing that I shall not ever, ever forget, and that is the vroom, vroom, vroom of the fleets of the big bombers coming over, and the gratefulness when we had them. It was like angels flying over. And thank you all very, very much.
Thank you, Charlotte, another wonderful lady. And last but not least, to the gentleman on the far left here, who we haven't forgotten, and I think he probably thinks we have, Lee Shorty Gordon, a legend in his own lifetime.
Well, I want to get right down to it, and I want you to hear this, because Dorothy there interrogated me when I got back for 2 weeks, and she gave up, and I was still talking for another 2 weeks. So I'm going to really have to cut my 5 minutes down. I got shot down February 26, 1943, Willem-Toppen. Was with another group, 5 got killed, 3 of us wounded, all picked, the 5 of us that lived got picked up right away, lived right in the middle of Germany. We ended up down to Dulag Luft. They interrogated about a week down there, then they shipped us out. Well, over to Kront in boxcars. I said, oh, this is a hell of a way to get to Germany and be a tourist. All the way across to Poland, they threw us in a prison camp up there, Stalag 8B. It was the first, most of them were British out there. At this time, there was only 70 American enlisted men as PWs. That's how early in the war it was for us. Because the raid I got shot down was the second raid on Germany proper. Well, I guess they didn't know what to do. They thought we were Indians out there. They were supposed to separate all the nationalities. So they put us in with the Hindus for a while. And this was pretty good because those people didn't eat meat and so forth, so we had a little more to eat all the time. But I want to get it across to you right now. Wasn't anything like this Hogan's Heroes. Come on. It was rough. If you had a sawdust sandwich, that was good. And we didn't have any sawdust sandwich. They just give it in big loaves to you. Well, they finally decided to ship us out of there and start an American camp. The first camp for enlisted men, it was Stalag 7A at Moosburg. Well, some of them decided to make a break. Well, we didn't know much about it. We figured all we had to do was just get away from the Germans, and we were on our way. That was just the start. Well, we started across Germany. We got over near Czechoslovakia, and as the train, what happened is they had 50 of us in a boxcar. You ought to try that, 50 guys riding in a boxcar. You sit on top of each other's heads. And they decided they didn't want to let us go out to go to the toilet once in a while, so what would you do? Over your shoulder, It was rough, let's face it. Well, we didn't like that boxcar so bad, so 8 of us decided to make a break. We got the door of the boxcar open. When that train was going up a steep grade, we jumped off a train. Well, you ought to try to jump off a train going 40 miles an hour. Wow, there was plenty of excitement there. The other fellow was Arnold Schultz from New York. He and I decided to team up, but we started to jump, and there was a big ravine there, so we had to hold up for a minute. This was the middle of the night. Well, 8 of us got off there, all right. We didn't get shot. The other guy said, oh, don't escape with us. They're liable to shoot us. And they said, well, you got a chance to go with us. Why get shot? Well, we got out, we were only walking around here about 2 days. We didn't know what to do, you know. When you end up in a foreign country, you can't speak the language and everything, you think you're going to walk out of the country. But it's 600 or 700 miles across Germany, a long way anyway. Well, we got caught. We were walking through this small town, and the police got us. And one part that I do want to tell you, I want to take a drink of water because it did make my mouth dry. It was plenty dry. The fellow I was with was a Jewish fellow from New York, Bernard Schultz. And they got us in this, the German police picked us up first, and they took us into a sort of a Nazi gathering. And they all had their armbands on with swastikas, and I'm saying to myself, I'm in trouble. And about that time, over in the corner, they were all running in, piling each other like a bunch of idiots. And they took Salt's over on the side. The next thing, Salt threw his hands up in his air. And I thought, uh-oh, what are they doing with him? They pulled out a Luger and stuck it in his back. Rump, rump. Salt marched out. Man, my knees are shaking by this time. I figured, whoa, he's going to get it because they looked at our dog tags and saw they were Jewish. And I heard him out say, Jew. That's when he whipped out this revolver. I said, he's first, I'm next. Well, here comes Salt walking back in. And I said, where did you go? He said, oh, I had to go to the toilet. And I said, I did too, but I didn't go out. He scared me more than the Germans. Well, they threw us in a local jail there for about a week. And I got to know how it was to lay around jail. I got so many incidents, I have to go through this in 5 minutes. So they shipped me down to a guard coming to pick us up. It's a good thing Salt knew a little German, because our guard got lost and we had to tell him how to get on the train to get back to the southern place at Moosburg. We finally got down to Moosburg, and because we were escapees, they threw us in the cooler. Well, I'll tell you what, I know what that cooler looks like. I spent most of my time in that cooler. This first time, 40 days in the cooler. Wasn't too bad, you know. I got out for an hour to walk around and sniff some little fresh air once in a while. But man, have you ever heard of a French cootie? We had 500,000 up in that barracks with us, and 40 days of that. Well, they finally decided I'd have enough to straighten me up. I was incorrigible, they said, so they turned me loose. So right away I started figuring out escape again. Well, I made my next escape, and I worked on a work detail with the infantry boys that weren't sergeants. If you were a sergeant, you didn't have to work. Well, I took the place of an infantry fellow, went on the burial detail, and they covered me up good. We were pulling the wagon down the road, had it all planned. It was about 30 of us. All of a sudden, I stepped behind a tree. Well, I didn't get about another 10 yards down the road, and I heard, "Stop from then, crucifix!" In other words, we were counting, and I was gone. Boy, the next thing I knew, I'd run across the road right behind him, went into an old field, pushed the old stuff, and lay down out there. Well, I thought that was the end of that, but this guy stopped the car going down the road. The next thing, to go back in, they got the dogs out, and they're all over the place. Man, I'm hugging the ground. I'm kissing that ground. I laid there, and they ran all over, and they hollered, "We hear you hiding there. Come out or we'll shoot." Well, I didn't stand up to get shot. I laid right there. Well, I'll make it quick. I met a German corporal. He was the only German that I saw while he was in captivity could be bribed. But he was being bribed by a British sergeant major, and he was being bribed good. Well, he met me out there that night near the old field, under a bridge with a bicycle in a Hitler Youth uniform. Well, I spent the next couple of days going across Germany, and one incident that really got me. I'm riding down the road on my bike. Here comes a Hitler Youth, all marching, you know, boys, 12, 14, 16 years, you know, singing Deutschland over all this. So when I got up to him, my Hitler Youth uniform, Heil, Bill, Heil, boy, this is great. I just rode the bike a little faster down that road. Well, I had bad luck again. Pulled off the road one night, sleep in a haystack one night, and a watchtower with Germans in it were overlooking the countryside. They spotted me. The next thing, I was captured, back into the boot for another 30 days. Well, I stayed in that 30 days. As soon as I got out, I started getting ready for my next escape. And I met a Frenchman. I always had good luck with Frenchmen. They were on our side. And he told me, well, if if I could get to Munich, I could beat some people in Munich. I tried it before on the Viking escape also, but I couldn't speak French, couldn't speak German, I couldn't even speak English. As you can tell. So by guys, I got out of camp again. I can't go into how I got out of camp. So I used to just walk in and out like Hogan's Heroes, huh? Let's face it. Anyway, I got out of camp, got into Munich. After about 2 weeks hiding out in French commandos, they called them, French people and foreign people that had to work for the Germans, they were hiding me out in these barracks. The only interesting thing, one place was raided. I was hanging out with some Yugoslavians, and I was tipped off I was going to be raiding, so they told me, oh, go over to this other barracks, and I had to go over there and sleep with 20 French girls. Oh, wow. I hate to leave Munich. This was right down in Munich in 1943. So they had to drag me out of Munich. I rose trained out into France. When I got into France, I hit the French underground, and it was pretty exciting. I had a lot of exciting times in France there. I started out once in January of 1944. I started out in a operation run by a French fellow called Monsieur Fonfon. Well, it was about, I think there was only about 4 or 5 of us Americans and British on the boat, and we're heading back to England. We got into rough seas, beat the planking out of the boat. We ended up back in France. Some of the fellows got caught. It wasn't so good for Monsieur Fonfon. They got shot. And I was again ready to loose. I worked my way back to Paris. I was staying with a doctor and Madame Bourgeois, which unfortunately they were both caught, and she died. So, here I was again. I got hooked up with Marcel Cola, that was working for Operation Shelburne, and I went out the same way, a month ahead of Ralph there, and got back to England.
Before we open the meeting for questions, I'm going to go back to George Van Rimmenden, because we did only give him 4 minutes, and he tells me that he has another amusing tale. So, George, if you could tell us a fairly short amusing tale of your experiences, we're very pleased to listen.
I hope you remember my little story, how we took the people out of that hospital in Utrecht, and one day we took the wrong road and ended up on the main road to Arnhem. So I made it back. We found the Dutchman again, but to prove how lucky we were, sometimes not only guts and not only intelligence or whatever it was, but it needed it to get away with the things we did. The next day I found out that on the road we normally took through the farmland, the Germans that day had a checkpoint, and everybody that flew by there were checked. So if we hadn't got lost in Utrecht that day, I don't think it would be here now. So just to prove how lucky we were. I think you all know what luck meant during the time that you were up there. Thank you. That's all.
Gentleman on the left. Something seems to be wrong with the microphone.
Wally Cole, 398 Bonds Group, ex-DOW. I was in a prison hospital, Apeldoorn, Holland. There was an escape out of there, which I'm familiar with. I frankly assisted. 2 English flyers, 1 American flyer. This occurred the last part of January 1945. I'm wondering what source I can go to, or if there's anything I can find out about the success or the failure of that 3-man escape.
Is there any member of the panel who can answer that? I think that
let me just take one pass, and that is, if you are able to give us a name, then we can determine whether or not they successfully evaded. And if they did, perhaps we can go from there to help answer your question. but we can't do it in just this minute of time. But if you'll contact me and can give me a name, incidentally, wow, you've just really given me the opportunity. They say behind every good man is a better woman. I'm going to ask my wife to stand up. She happens to have written 4,000 or 5,000 letters to have most of our 900 plus membership, and she probably has more knowledge up here about evasions and the people involved than anybody in the audience, in spite of all the work that these women back here did.
If you have a question, sir, would you like to go to the microphone? There's one here.
My name's Art Horning.
We're back in business here.
All I'd like to know, is that list going to be published and available to other members of the agency? Number two, Bobby, will you please help us with how you got captured?
Yes, I can. I was waiting at the station, the North Station in Brussels, for the Dutch passeur to bring one or two airmen over from Holland and to take them. And he was apparently already, this passeur was already taken in a razzia in Malines, Mechelen, and when he came with a Gestapo man in overalls, and of course it was very difficult to find clothing for them, so they usually had farm clothing on, I mean what the farmers had available for them and so on. So I thought, and he didn't give me a sign, the passeur didn't give me a sign or anything, and I was waiting outside of the what do you call it, platform there. And all of a sudden they came out and I saw a revolver under my nose and Henderhoek. And so I was standing there, and then I was taken to Antwerp and was interrogated there for the night. And then I was brought to the barracks of the Chateau de Laken, and I stayed there for about fully 2 months. And then I went to the prison of Saint-Gilles in Brussels, and from there, eventually, after having been condemned to death, I was transported to Germany, where I went to several prisons, and I was liberated by the Russians, which I'm still very grateful for always.
Thank you, Charlotte. Yes, sir.
I'm Charles Henry. I was with the 8th Air Force. I shot down my 5th Nation. Found out later it was near Awali. My first interrogation was in Charleroi. Then I was later sent to Brussels, Belgium, interrogated, and then said no. But today, I don't understand why they signed the Geneva Convention and they didn't uphold it. We were forgotten people. I know the Belgian underground tried to get to me immediately. In fact, they were with me before I was captured. They had taken off, and they had told me that it was just about 5 minutes after I got down my parachute and got my GI boots on that the Germans had picked me up, and that was at Awali, southern Belgium.
My father was German, so I was born a German, and my mother being Dutch, I was born in Holland myself, so I had, in a way, I had a double nationality. I was very much against the Nazis, and which you can understand. And when I see what is happening now in Germany, I must say that I am very, very, very frightened. And I hope that something can be done against it, that the German government will do something in order to quell the new uprising of the Nazis there.
Thank you, Shannon.
Ask us how we think about the Germans now. I was telling you a little while ago how lucky we were sometimes and how I lucked that day. But 5 days before the war ended, my luck ran out too, and I was arrested by the Gestapo by the name of a guy by the name of Cunard, who later escaped to Paraguay, but otherwise he would have been sentenced to death. He was a Gestapo guy. And they beat the hell out of me for 5 days every 3 hours. They wanted to know where we had the weapons hidden because they were afraid that when it was all over, that we would kill as many as we could. Anyway, I didn't tell them where the weapons were, and that's why they keep beating me. So, the last day I was transported to a jail in Utrecht, and I thought I was going to be shot there.